They called him the Obsidian King. Kang Min-Jae didn't just rule Seoul's underworld, he owned the silence within it. It was said his shadow froze the ground he walked on, and his only mercy was a quick death. His mansion was a silent cathedral of glass and steel, governed by one absolute decree: privacy is survival. Rule number 1, no strangers ever. But on a chaotic Monday night, Amara, his trembling maid, had no choice. With the city screaming in the wake of a devastating explosion, she brought the only person she had left, her grandmother, Mama Victoria, into the heart of the monster's lair. The massive steel-reinforced doors hissed open. Cold rain lashed against the pristine marble of the grand foyer. Amara's breath hitched as a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the hall. Steady, heavy, merciless. Kang Min-Jae appeared like a phantom, his charcoal suit jacket torn, fresh blood staining the cuffs of his white silk shirt from a nightmare he had just finished. Behind him, his elite guards, Gun-woo and Dong-ho, stood like stone statues, their hands hovering over concealed weapons. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Mama Victoria close, shielding her grandmother's frail body with her own. She waited for the cold click of a trigger, the sound that would end their lives for trespassing. But the gunshot never came. Instead, she heard a sound that defied reality, the soft, heavy rustle of expensive wool hitting the floor. When Amara opened her eyes, the most feared man in Korea wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was on his knees, his forehead nearly touching the marble, his powerful frame shaking. And on his face, for the first time in 30 years, were hot, desperate tears. "Mama," he whispered, his voice splintering like glass. "I thought the fire took you. I thought I was alone." Why would the iron boss of Seoul surrender his pride to a humble woman from halfway across the globe? What happened in a Houston alleyway 30 years ago that could turn a devil back into a boy? The secrets of the Obsidian King are finally coming to light. What do you think Mama Victoria will do next? Share your predictions in the comments below. If you're gripped by this story of ancient debts and unexpected family, hit that like button. Let us know where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The sirens of Seoul wailed in a dissonant chorus, a jagged contrast to the oppressive silence of the Kang estate. 2 hours before Min-Jae's knees hit the marble, the sky had turned a sickly orange. From the balcony of the servant quarters, Amara had watched the plume of smoke rise over the district where the St. Jude Care home stood. A gas main had ruptured, turning the sanctuary into a skeleton of twisted metal and flame. Amara didn't think about the iron law. She didn't think about the biometric logs or the infrared cameras that ringed the perimeter. She only thought of the woman who had braided her hair every Sunday morning since she was 5. The drive to the evacuation site was a blur of hydroplaning tires and frantic prayers. When she found Mama Victoria sitting on a damp plastic crate, clutching her wooden cane as if it were a lifeline, the elderly woman's eyes were cloudy with shock, her skin gray against the harsh emergency lights. "We can't stay here, Mama," Amara whispered, throwing her own coat over Victoria's shoulders. "The temporary shelters are full, and your lungs can't take the smoke." "Where are we going, child?" Victoria's voice was a brittle rasp. "Somewhere safe," Amara lied. Her stomach twisted into a cold knot. The mansion was many things: a fortress, a museum, a tomb, but it was never safe for a guest. The return journey was a dance with shadows. Amara used her high-level clearance keycard to bypass the service gate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every sweep of the security cameras felt like a physical touch. She guided Victoria through the delivery entrance, the elderly woman's cane tapping softly, a sound that felt like a drumbeat in the hollow kitchen. "Just for tonight," Amara breathed, tucking Victoria into the narrow bed of her own small room. "Mr. Kang is at a meeting in Incheon. He never comes to this wing. He won't even know you're here." Victoria reached out, her hand weathered and warm, patting Amara's cheek. "You always were a brave one, Amara, But even a lion's den is just a house if you know how to talk to the lion. Amara didn't share that optimism. She spent the next hour scrubbing the mud from the floor, her eyes darting toward the door. She checked the internal schedule on her tablet. Min-Jae wasn't expected until dawn. She had time to find a hotel, time to move her, time to breathe. Then the sudden thunder of the front doors echoed through the vents. The schedule had changed. The Obsidian King had returned early, and he was not alone. The scent of ozone and copper drifted through the air, the smell of a man who had just brought the world to its knees. And Mama Victoria, confused by the strange surroundings, had already stood up, her cane tapping a steady rhythm toward the light of the main hall. The air in the grand foyer shifted from the sterile scent of expensive wax to the heavy, metallic tang of violence. Kang Min-Jae moved through the entrance like a predator returning from a kill, his stride predatory and uneven. His navy suit jacket was gone, left behind in some dark alley or incinerated in a getaway car. His white dress shirt was a ruin. Crimson splatters bloomed across the silk like dark carnations, and his knuckles were raw, the skin split from the kind of impact that breaks bone. Behind him, Gunwoo and Dongho moved in perfect, silent synchronization, their faces masks of professional indifference that hid the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. They had just survived a calculated ambush at the docks, and the Obsidian King was in no mood for failure. His jaw was set so tight it looked as though it might shatter, his eyes burning with a cold, flickering rage that usually preceded an execution. He didn't head for his bedroom. He headed for the sanctuary of his private study, the one room in the sprawling fortress where the world was not allowed to follow. He needed the darkness and the silence to shed the monster he had become tonight. Amara stood paralyzed in the shadows of the servants' corridor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had seen the bloody cuffs of his sleeves and the lethal set of his shoulders. She tried to move, to call out, to somehow intercept the collision that was seconds away, but her voice was a ghost in her throat. Min-Jae kicked the heavy oak doors of the study open, the wood groaning on its hinges. He expected the room to be a tomb of shadows and leather. Instead, a soft, golden light from a single floor lamp spilled across the rug. And there, sitting in his high-backed leather throne, the chair where he had signed death warrants and moved millions with a single keystroke, was a stranger. Mama Victoria sat with her back straight, her hands folded over the head of her wooden cane. She didn't flinch at the violent entry. She didn't cower at the sight of the blood-stained man who looked like death incarnate. She simply looked at him, her expression a calm, unbothered sea of wisdom. "Who are you?" Min-Jae's voice was a low, guttural growl, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon tucked into his waistband. The guards surged forward, their guns clearing their holsters in a chorus of metallic clicks. Laser sights danced across the brown cardigan of the elderly woman, two red dots coming to rest right over her heart. "Nana, no," Amara finally found her voice, stumbling into the room and throwing herself into the line of fire. "Please, Mr. Kang, she didn't know, she's lost." But Min-Jae didn't hear her. He was frozen, his hand still on his belt, his eyes locked onto Victoria's face. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the Obsidian King did something that made the world stop spinning. He let out a ragged, choked breath, his weapon slipping from his numb fingers to the floor as 30 years of armor disintegrated in a single heartbeat. The marble floor felt like ice beneath his knees, but the cold was nothing compared to the heat of the memory rushing back to claim him. Suddenly, the pristine walls of the Seoul mansion dissolved into the humid, shimmering asphalt of a Houston summer in 1996. The air had smelled of exhaust and rotting garbage. 8-year-old Min-Jae was pinned against a rusted chain-link fence, his small hands over his ears to drown out the taunts he barely understood. He was the ghost, the kid whose father had died in a shipyard accident and whose mother had vanished into the haze of a shiftwork addiction. He had stolen a single loaf of bread from the corner market, and now The neighborhood's youngest gang initiates were determined to make him pay in blood. A heavy boot connected with his stomach, and the world tilted. He tasted copper and grit. Just as a jagged piece of glass was raised to mark his face, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the alley. Thwack! The lead bully shrieked, clutching his wrist. Standing at the mouth of the alley was a woman who looked like a titan against the setting sun. Victoria Obi didn't look like a savior. She looked like an executioner. She wore a floral Sunday dress and a brown cardigan that fluttered in the breeze, but it was the heavy, dark wood of her cane that held the boys' undivided attention. "You get your hands off that boy," she commanded. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, resonant boom that vibrated in Min-Jae's very bones. "Mind your business, old lady." One of them spat, though he backed away. Victoria took a step forward, the rhythmic asterisk thump-tap asterisk of her cane echoing off the brick walls like a war drum. "I am the business of this neighborhood. Now, you can run home to your mothers, or I can show you exactly why they call me Mama Victoria. Choose fast." They chose flight. As the boys scrambled over the fence, the silence that followed was heavy with Min-Jae's ragged sobs. He curled into a ball, waiting for the woman to yell or hand him over to the police. Instead, he felt a soft, warm hand on his matted black hair. She knelt beside him, her joints protesting with a faint creak, and pulled a clean handkerchief from her sleeve. She wiped the blood from his lip with a tenderness that felt like a physical shock to his system. "Child," she whispered, looking into his terrified eyes, "you aren't a ghost, you're a miracle, and miracles don't starve on my watch." She had taken his hand, the same hand that now gripped the marble of his study, and led him to a tiny apartment that smelled of time, palm oil, and safety. For 3 months, he wasn't a street rat. He was her son. Until the black sedans from the homeland arrived to drag him back to a life of iron and ice, leaving him only with a promise he thought the years had killed. The transition from the blood-stained study to the dawn of a new era was as sharp as a blade. By sunrise, the mansion's atmosphere had shifted from a fortress of terror to a house under divine reconstruction. The heavy, gold-trimmed curtains were thrown open for the first time in years, letting the Seoul sunlight expose every cold corner of Min-Jae's isolation. It began at the breakfast table. Gun-woo, the head of security, stood by the sideboard, his hand resting habitually on his holster. As Mama Victoria reached for a porcelain teapot, Gun-woo let out a sharp, impatient huff, his lip curling in a brief flash of irritation at the delay in his boss's schedule. "We have a meeting with the port authorities, boss," he muttered, his eyes darting toward Victoria with a flicker of condescension. "The old woman is slowing us down." The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Min-Jae, who had been listening to Victoria describe the proper way to season jollof rice, set his silver fork down with a rhythmic asterisk clink that sounded like a hammer on a nail. He stood slowly, his tailored suit hiding the fresh bandages on his shoulder, and walked until he was inches from his top soldier. "This woman," Min-Jae said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the glassware on the table tremble, "gave me breath when the world wanted me smothered. She is the crown of this house." "Boss, I only meant—" "You meant that you have forgotten who owns your life," Min-Jae interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, which made the threat even more lethal. "Pack your weapons. If your shadow is still touching my gates in 10 minutes, I will ensure it never leaves the soil. You are done." As Gun-woo stumbled out in a daze of terror, Min-Jae turned to Amara, who was standing by the door, her hands gripped tightly in her white apron. She expected a reprimand for the chaos of the night before, but Min-Jae's gaze had softened into something unrecognizable, a look of profound, aching gratitude. "Amara," he said, stepping toward her, "the uniform, take it off." Amara blinked, her breath catching. "Sir, you are no longer a servant here. You are the woman who protected my life when you brought her to me. From this moment, you are my executive secretary. You will manage my schedule, my affairs, and my house." He paused, his eyes moving to Mama Victoria, who was watching him with a knowing maternal pride. "But in this family, you are my sister. Your word carries my seal. Anyone who looks at you with anything less than absolute respect will answer to the Obsidian King." Amara felt the weight of years of invisibility slide off her shoulders. She looked at Victoria, then at the man who had been a monster yesterday and a brother today. The Iron Law hadn't just been broken, it had been rewritten in a language of debt and blood. The mansion's kitchen, once a sterile laboratory of stainless steel and silent Michelin-starred chefs, succumbed to a vibrant, aromatic coup d'etat within 48 hours. The professional staff stood in a bewildered line against the wall, relegated to sous chefs under the unwavering direction of Mama Victoria. She had traded her brown cardigan for a vibrant encre-print apron, her wooden cane hooked over the edge of a marble counter as she commanded the space with the authority of a general. The air, usually thin and scentless, grew thick with the intoxicating steam of sautéing onions, fermented locust beans, and the sharp, bright heat of Scotch bonnet peppers. When the clock struck 7, Min-Jae descended the grand staircase, his mind occupied by the escalating tensions with the Black Dragon Triad. He expected his usual dinner, a cold, precise arrangement of sashimi or a lonely Wagyu steak. Instead, he was met by a wall of heat and the rhythmic asterisk thud-thud of a wooden spoon against a heavy pot. "Sit," Victoria commanded, not looking up from the stove. Min-Jae hesitated, his hand reaching for the tablet displaying shipping manifests. "Mama, I have a conference call with Singapore in 20 minutes. I'll just have a coffee in my—" "I did not spend 4 hours over this pot for you to drink bean water," she interrupted, finally turning to fix him with a look that had once intimidated Houston's most dangerous street gangs. "You look like a man made of paper, Min-Jae. Sit. Eat." To the absolute shock of the remaining guards, the Obsidian King pulled out a chair and sat. Amara appeared, no longer in her maid's uniform but in a tailored silk blouse, her eyes dancing with suppressed amusement as she set a steaming bowl of okra soup and a plate of vibrant, smoky jollof rice before him. The soup was a rich, emerald green, filled with tender chunks of goat meat and fish, glistening with a thin veil of red palm oil. Min-Jae stared at the plate. It had been 3 decades since he had seen food that looked like it had a soul. He picked up his spoon, but Victoria's hand was suddenly on his wrist. "Grace first," she whispered. In the middle of a fortress built on blood and secular power, the leader of the Kang Syndicate lowered his head. He listened to the soft, rhythmic lilt of Victoria's prayer, the words flowing over him like a balm. When he finally took a bite, the explosion of flavor, the smokiness of the rice, the earthy depth of the okra hit him with the force of a physical revelation. It tasted like a childhood he had almost forgotten. It tasted like the only time in his life he had ever been truly safe. He ate until the plate was clean, his high-collared suit feeling a little tighter, his heart feeling a little less like a block of ice. Across the table, Victoria nodded in approval, her expression a mixture of triumph and tenderness. "Good boy," she murmured, patting his hand. And for the first time in his adult life, the man who ruled through fear felt full. The warmth of the kitchen was a fragile sanctuary, easily pierced by the cold reality of the streets outside. While the scent of Victoria's spices lingered in the mansion's vents, a different, more acrid odor was rising in the dark corners of the city, the scent of a predator sensing a wound. Deep within a neon-lit club in Gangnam, hidden behind soundproof glass and thick plumes of cigar smoke, Lee Sang-woo, the merciless leader of the Black Dragon Triad, stared at a grainy photograph on a digital tablet. The image, captured by a long-range lens, showed the Obsidian King standing in a grocery store aisle, his head bowed as he carefully selected a specific brand of parboiled rice under the watchful eye of an elderly black woman. "He's gone soft," Sang-woo whispered, his voice like sandpaper on silk. A thin, jagged scar across his cheek twitched as he smiled. "The man who once leveled a city block to find a trader is now carrying bags for a grandmother. He isn't a king anymore. He's a servant." His lieutenants leaned in, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. For years, the Kang Syndicate had been an impenetrable wall because Min-Jae had nothing to lose. He was a ghost with a gun, a man who slept in a fortress and loved nothing but his power. But the Iron Law had been breached. The fortress now had a heart, and a heart was nothing more than a bullseye. "We strike where he feels the most," Sang-woo commanded, tapping the image of Mama Victoria. "Min-Jae has built a world around this woman. If we take her, we don't just kill him. We break him. We make the Obsidian King watch as his miracle turns into ash." Back at the mansion, the air felt unnervingly still. Min-Jae stood by the window of his study, his eyes tracking a black sedan that had passed the gate 3 times in the last hour. He felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, the way the silence felt heavy with hidden intent. Amara entered the room, her new silk suit rustling, but her face was pale. "The security feeds from the east gate are flickering, Yi," she said, using the name Victoria had restored to him. "And Gunwoo's encrypted signal just went active in a triad-controlled district." Min-Jae didn't turn around. He reached out and touched the glass, his reflection showing a man caught between 2 lives. The dragon was circling, its scent clogging his senses. He had found his family, but in the underworld, love was the most expensive debt a man could carry, and the triad was coming to collect. The table was set with a quiet, domestic elegance that felt like a miracle in a house built on secrets. The air was heavy with the scent of thyme and peppers, a warmth that usually signaled safety. Min-Jae sat at the head of the table, his dark navy suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up as he watched Mama Victoria meticulously serve a second helping of jollof rice. Across from him, Amara smiled. The tension of the day's security reports finally beginning to fade behind the steam of the home-cooked meal. "Eat Yi," Victoria said, her wooden cane leaning against the table's edge. "You're still thinking about those men in the dark. Tonight there is only us." Min-Jae picked up his fork, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. For a fleeting moment, the Obsidian King was absent. There was only a son, a grandmother, and a sister. Then the world shattered. A muffled asterisk thump vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of a perimeter guard's body hitting the grass. Min-Jae's fork never reached his mouth. His head snapped toward the grand windows, his eyes narrowing as the infrared sensors in the garden cut to black. "Get down," he roared, lunging across the table. He didn't wait for the glass to break. He tackled Mama Victoria and Amara to the floor just as the dining room windows exploded inward. A hail of lead chewed through the silk wallpaper and shattered the porcelain centerpiece, turning the family dinner into a storm of shards and silver. The lights flickered and died as the Black Dragon Triad breached the east wing. Through the settling dust, the red laser sights of tactical rifles began to dance across the dark room, hunting for the heart of the Kang Syndicate. "Amara, the kitchen pantry. There's a manual release for the basement," Min-Jae hissed, his voice a lethal rasp. He drew his weapon, a matte black pistol that felt like an extension of his own arm. He fired 2 precise shots into the hallway, the muzzle flashes illuminating the grim faces of the first wave of assassins. "I'm not leaving you," Amara cried, her voice trembling but her hand steady as she gripped Victoria's arm. "Go," Min-Jae commanded, his body positioned as a wall between them and the doorway. Victoria didn't scream. She reached out, her fingers brushing Min-Jae's shoulder as he prepared to step into the line of fire. "Don't you dare forget who you are, child," she whispered, her voice steady even as a grenade detonated in the foyer. Min-Jae rose into the smoke, a shadow made of iron and grief. He moved with a cold, terrifying grace, his weapon barking in the darkness. The dinner was over and the red night had begun. The devil of Seoul was back, but this time he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for home. The smoke in the dining hall was a thick, suffocating veil, illuminated only by the rhythmic, lethal strobe of muzzle flashes. Min-Jae moved with the desperation of a man who finally had something to lose. He pushed Amara toward the reinforced service door, but Mama Victoria stayed rooted to the floor, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped her wooden cane. "Get back," Min-Jae shouted, his voice cracking through the thunder of gunfire. A shadow emerged from the swirling dust, a black dragon hitman, his rifle leveled with clinical precision. He wasn't aiming for the boss. He was aiming for the woman in the cardigan. Time slowed to a jagged crawl. Min-Jae didn't calculate the trajectory or the risk. He simply threw himself into the path of the lead. A dull asterisk thud echoed as a bullet punched through his shoulder, the force spinning him violently. He crashed against the mahogany table, blood blooming across his silk shirt, a dark, hot crimson that matched the spilled wine from their ruined dinner. "Yi," Amara screamed, reaching for him, but Min-Jae slumped against the wood, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The hitman stepped forward to finish the job, his boots crunching on the shattered porcelain. But before he could pull the trigger, a sound rang out that stopped the air in the room. "Thak." Mama Victoria stepped into the center of the room. She didn't hide. She didn't tremble. She stood between the armed killer and her wounded boy, her spine as straight as the day she had faced down the Houston sun. She raised her wooden cane, not as a weapon of war, but as a scepter of absolute authority. "You have spilled enough blood in this house," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, resonant boom that seemed to vibrate the very glass shards on the floor. The assassin hesitated. He was a professional, trained to kill kings and devils, but he had never been stared down by a grandmother who looked at his rifle as if it were a disobedient child's toy. That second of confusion was all the opening needed. Min-Jae, teeth bared in a snarl of agony and love, forced himself upward. Using his good arm, he lunged from the shadows of the table, his blade finding the hitman's throat with the silent finality of a predator. As the man fell, Min-Jae didn't look at his enemy. He collapsed against Victoria's legs, his blood staining her floral dress. "Mama," he wheezed, his vision blurring. "Go, please." Victoria dropped her cane and sank to the floor, pulling his head into her lap. She ignored the gunfire still echoing in the distant wings of the mansion. "SHH, child," she whispered, her weathered hands pressing against his wound to stem the tide. "I told you once before, miracles don't die on my watch." The silence that followed the final gunshot was heavier than the violence itself. As the first light of dawn filtered through the smoke-blackened windows of the mansion, the Black Dragon triad lay broken, their ambition scattered like the shards of porcelain on the dining room floor. Min-Jae leaned against the scarred mahogany table, his breathing shallow but steady. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire of shadows, and then at the woman who had just cleaned the blood from his brow with a scrap of her floral apron. "It's over, Yi," Amara whispered, stepping over the threshold of the ruined study. She held a tablet in one hand, but her other was gripped firmly by Mama Victoria. "The rival cells have surrendered. The city is quiet." Min-Jae looked at Mama Victoria, whose calm presence had survived the night's storm. She didn't look at him with fear, nor did she look at him as a king. She looked at him as a boy who had finally grown tired of his own armor. "A man cannot live in a fortress forever, child," Victoria said, her voice a soft, resonant bell in the quiet hall. "A house is for living. A life is for building. You fought enough wars for 10 lifetimes. When are you going to start living yours?" The Obsidian King stood, his movements stiff from the bandages beneath his shirt. He looked at Gunwoo's empty post and the tactical map still glowing on his desk. With a single, decisive swipe, he cleared the screens to black. "Amara," he said, his voice no longer a lethal rasp but something grounded and firm. "Liquidate the holdings, the docks, the clubs, the offshore accounts, all of it. We are pivoting. The Kang Foundation will be a name for schools, for housing, for the people this city forgot. I am done being the devil." Amara nodded, a tear of relief finally escaping. And the mansion. Min-Jae looked at the garden where the red laser sights had danced only hours ago. We'll fix the windows. We'll plant the hibiscus Mama likes. We'll make it a home. A month later, the city's whispers changed. The devil of Seoul had vanished, replaced by a man who was frequently seen walking through the neighborhood markets, carrying a heavy shopping bag in one hand and supporting an elderly woman's arm with the other. The legendary ruthlessness was gone, but in its place was a different kind of strength, one forged in the heat of a Houston alleyway and tempered by the steam of a kitchen filled with love. As they sat on the rebuilt veranda, the scent of jollof rice drifting through the open doors, Min-Jae realized that Victoria was right. The greatest power wasn't found in the trigger of a gun, but in the courage to be seen by the people who truly knew your heart. The Obsidian King was dead. The sun had finally come home.